Dr. Alistair Finch was a man who understood the language of stone. He could read the history of 1 billion years in a single rock face, discerning the violent upheavals and the patient, grinding pressure that had shaped the world. He was a geologist, but to his wife Elena, he was an interpreter of the Earth's silent, epic stories. The photograph arrived on her phone at 11:42 a.m. on a Tuesday in September. It was a selfie, slightly breathless and filled with the brilliant high-altitude sunlight of the Colorado Rockies. Alistair's face, framed by the hood of his technical jacket, was split by a wide, earnest grin. Behind him, the jagged peaks of the Sawatch Range clawed at a sapphire sky, their immense scale making him seem both small and perfectly at home. The text message that accompanied it was typical Alistair, concise, loving, and laced with scientific excitement. Found a promising formation. Weather is perfect. Love you both. Elena smiled, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach. Both. He never forgot. Their first child was still 5 months away from seeing the world, but to Alistair, he was already part of the expedition. He was already a member of their small, happy family. She texted back a simple, "We love you, be safe," and went about her day, the image of his smiling face a warm ember in her mind. The day faded into a cool, clear evening. The mountains on the horizon, the same ones that held her husband, turned from gray granite to soft purple silhouettes against a sunset bleeding orange and rose. 8 o'clock came and went. The prearranged check-in time on his satellite phone passed without a call. At first, Elena felt no alarm. She was married to a field scientist. Delays were normal. A fascinating sample could stretch minutes into an hour. The complex task of documenting a find could easily push a schedule. She made dinner, the silence of their home punctuated only by the hum of the refrigerator. 9 o'clock. The silence began to change. It was no longer peaceful. It was active, a heavy blanket pressing in on her. She rationalized. He could have lost track of time. His battery could have died, despite his meticulous habit of carrying 3 spare power banks. He was Alistair, competent, prepared, cautious to a fault. 10 o'clock. The rationalizations crumbled, turning to dust. Dread, cold and specific, began to seep into the room. Alistair Finch did not miss check-ins. It was the cardinal rule of his work, a promise he had made to her before his very first solo expedition. It was the line that, if crossed, meant something was wrong. She stared at the phone, willing it to ring, to buzz, to show any sign of life from the high peaks. The silence was absolute. It was the profound, unthinking silence of the wilderness itself, an entity that did not care for schedules or promises. By 11, the dread had crystallized into a certainty that was both terrifying and strangely calming. Action was required. Her hands were steady as she dialed the number for the Gunnison County Sheriff's Office. She spoke to a dispatcher, her voice even, reciting the facts with the detached precision of a scientist reporting data. His name, Dr. Alistair Finch. His objective, geological survey in the Fossil Ridge Wilderness. His intended route, which he had mapped for her down to the last waypoint. His vehicle, a dark gray Ford Bronco, license plate number committed to memory. The dispatcher's voice was professional, reassuring, but Elena could hear the unspoken truth in the spaces between the words. A man was overdue in the Sawatch Range. The night was getting cold. The first official confirmation came just after dawn. A park ranger found the Bronco parked at the Sentinel Pass trailhead, exactly where Alistair had said it would be. It was locked. Through the window, the ranger could see a half-eaten apple and a copy of a geological journal on the passenger seat. The scene was utterly, horribly normal. It was a silent testament to a journey begun but not concluded. He had walked up that trail and into the vast, indifferent wilderness, and had simply not walked back out. The search began as a textbook operation, a display of human resolve against the raw power of the wild. A command post blossomed at the trailhead, a cluster of trailers and tents buzzing with the controlled chaos of an emergency response. It was run by David Kane, a veteran Park Service ranger with a face weathered like the mountains he patrolled and eyes that had seen too many of these efforts begin with the same grim hope. Resources poured in from across the state. Search and rescue teams, their bright orange jackets stark against the deep greens and grays of the terrain, assembled for grid assignments. Canine units arrived, the dogs whining with eagerness, their powerful noses ready to decipher the complex tapestry of scents on the wind. Helicopters chopped the thin mountain air, their rotors beating a rhythmic drum of urgency as they circled the high basins and jagged ridgelines. They were searching for a man, but they were battling a god. The mountains were not merely a location, they were an active, hostile participant in the search. The terrain was a nightmare of shattered rock and steep, unforgiving slopes. Scree fields, vast rivers of loose stone, shifted underfoot, threatening to send a searcher tumbling with every step. Below the tree line, dense subalpine forests of spruce and fir grew so thick they swallowed light and sound, tangling the search teams in a labyrinth of deadfall and shadows. The wilderness resisted them. The weather, which had been so perfect in Alistair's last photograph, turned fickle and violent. Sudden, ferocious thunderstorms rolled in from the west, their dark clouds clinging to the peaks and unleashing torrents of rain and hail. Lightning split the sky, forcing the helicopters to retreat and the ground teams to hunker down in a frustrating, dangerous stasis. The temperature plummeted at night, a stark reminder of the stakes. Days blurred into a week. The initial surge of adrenaline and determined optimism began to fray, worn thin by exhaustion and the sheer, overwhelming emptiness of the landscape. The core of the mystery was not what they were finding, but what they were not. They found nothing. Absolutely nothing. There were no footprints, not even a scuff mark on a rock that could be definitively identified. There was no dropped piece of gear, no glove, no water bottle, no lens cap from his camera. There was no scrap of fabric snagged on a thorny bush. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of a fall, no indication of a campsite. They scoured the area around his intended research coordinates, a place he had described as a promising formation. They found the unique geological outcropping, a distinctive band of quartz-shot granite, but Alistair's presence was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had reached his destination and simply evaporated into the thin, cold air. Most unnerving was the silence from his personal locator beacon. Alistair carried a state-of-the-art PLB, a device that, with the press of a button, would transmit a distress signal and his exact GPS coordinates via satellite. He was fanatically diligent about its maintenance. No signal was ever detected. This fact alone sent a chill through the command post. For the beacon not to be activated meant one of three things. He had been incapacitated so suddenly he couldn't press the button, the device had suffered a catastrophic and simultaneous failure, or it was somewhere it could not transmit, like deep underwater or underground. Ranger Kane stood before the massive topographical map at the command post each night, his face grim. The search grids were meticulously colored in, section by section, a testament to thousands of man-hours spent searching tens of thousands of acres of brutal country. The map was filling up with color, but the wilderness remained blank. It was holding its secrets tight. The lack of any clue at all was unnatural. It felt less like a tragedy and more like a magic trick, a world-class vanishing act performed on a stage of granite and sky. After 2 weeks, the operation began to scale down. The volunteers, their jobs and families calling them back to the world below, departed with somber handshakes and averted eyes. The helicopters were recalled for other duties. A skeleton crew of rangers continued to search, but the frantic urgency was gone, replaced by a grim, methodical thoroughness that felt more like a recovery mission than a rescue. Then, a flicker of hope. It came nearly 2 months after Alistair's disappearance, just as the first snows were beginning to dust the highest peaks. A bow hunter, tracking an elk through a remote basin several miles east of the primary search area, stumbled upon a compass half buried in the pine duff. It was a high-end Sunto model, its housing scratched and battered but its needle still pointing faithfully north. The hunter, aware of the ongoing search, marked the location, and brought it to the ranger station. When Elena saw the photograph of it, her breath caught in her throat. It was the same brand, the same model Alistair had carried for a decade. It was his. It had to be. The discovery re-energized the entire operation. A new, plausible theory emerged, one that explained the lack of clues in the original zone. Perhaps Alistair had become disoriented. Perhaps he had been chasing a geological feature off his intended route, suffered a fall, and had been crawling for help, moving far from where anyone expected him to be. It was a harrowing thought, but it was better than the void. It was a narrative, a thread to follow. Ranger Kane redeployed his teams to the new area. The hope was a palpable thing, a nervous energy that hummed through the crisp autumn air. Elena felt it too, a painful, fragile thing taking root in her chest. She imagined Alistair, injured but alive, waiting. The image was a torture and a comfort all at once. For 3 days they searched the new sector with a renewed, desperate intensity. The dead end came via a database query. Kane, ever the methodical investigator, had sent the compass's serial number to the manufacturer. The response arrived in an email that landed in his inbox like a ton of bricks. The compass had been reported lost 2 years earlier by a backpacker from Denver. It was a coincidence. A cruel, meaningless coincidence. The news crushed the last vestiges of optimism. The flicker of hope was extinguished, leaving an afterimage of disappointment that was somehow darker than the uncertainty before it. The resources, the time, the emotional energy all spent chasing a ghost. With winter now closing its icy fist around the high country, the official search was formally suspended. The press release used careful bureaucratic language. Efforts will be scaled back pending new information. But everyone knew what it meant. The case was going cold. The mountains had won. In the vacuum of facts, speculation began to fester. The story of the brilliant geologist who vanished had captured the public's imagination, and in the absence of a body or a clue, people began to write their own endings. Anonymous voices on internet forums, emboldened by distance and facelessness, spun cruel narratives. He had faked his death. There must have been a secret life insurance policy. He had a gambling problem, a hidden debt. He had simply run off, abandoning his pregnant wife for a new life. The theory of a marital dispute gained the most traction, built on nothing more than the ugly assumption that a man does not simply disappear without a reason, and the easiest reason to invent was a domestic one. The narrative shifted from that of a tragic accident to one of selfish desertion. Alistair, the man who was meticulous, responsible, and deeply in love with his growing family, was publicly recast as a coward and a liar. For Elena, this was a second, more insidious kind of loss. She was not only grieving a husband who was gone, but she was also forced to defend the memory of the man he had actually been against, a phantom built of baseless suspicion. She refused to let him be erased by this false narrative. She continued the search on her own terms. She hired a private investigator who re-interviewed every witness and re-examined every scrap of information, finding nothing new. She maintained a website, Find Alistair Finch, posting his picture, details of the case, and pleas for any information, no matter how small. It became her vigil, a digital candle burning against the encroaching darkness of the years. Every September, on the anniversary of his disappearance, she would drive up to the Sentinel Pass trailhead with their son, Liam. The boy grew from an infant in her arms to a toddler who would point at the towering peaks and say, "Daddy's mountains." He knew his father only through her stories, through the smiling face in the last photograph that Elena kept framed on her nightstand. The trips were a ritual of sorrow and defiance, a quiet promise to the silent stone that she would never stop looking, that they would never forget. 6 years passed. The world moved on. The case of Alistair Finch became a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale told to hikers about the unforgiving nature of the Rockies. The file at the sheriff's office gathered a thin layer of dust in a cold case cabinet. Ranger David Kane, now just a few years from a planned retirement, would sometimes pull it out on quiet nights, staring at the map of the search grid. The vast, blank spaces still mocked him. It was the one great failure of his career, a question mark that had settled deep in his soul. For Elena, the sharp, jagged edges of grief had worn down into a dull, persistent ache. Liam was 6 years old, a bright, inquisitive boy with his father's deep brown eyes. The public's cruel speculation had mostly faded away, leaving only the long, quiet agony of not knowing. Hope was no longer a fire. It was a single, stubborn ember that she shielded against the winds of time, refusing to let it die completely. The breakthrough, when it came, had nothing to do with vigils or investigations. It came from a place no one had ever thought to look, and it was found by two people who had never even heard the name Alistair Finch. Maya and Ben were graduate biology students from the University of Colorado. Their field of study was esoteric and highly specific: the behavioral patterns of the American pika, a tiny, resilient mammal that thrived in the harsh, high-altitude talus slopes of the Rockies. Their research required them to venture into some of the most remote and inaccessible parts of the range, far from any established trails, into the silent, shattered kingdoms of rock. One afternoon in late August, they were working in a basin several valleys away from Sentinel Pass. It was a desolate, beautiful place, a giant bowl of granite walled in by 14 zero-foot peaks. They were setting up motion-activated research cameras, hoping to capture footage of the elusive pikas as they gathered vegetation for their winter hay piles. As Maya adjusted the focus on a camera mounted to a tripod, a flash of light from a nearby rock field caught her eye. It wasn't the natural glint of mica or a patch of lingering ice. It was a sharp, synthetic reflection, jarringly out of place in the ancient, weathered landscape. She pointed it out to Ben. "What do you think that is?" she asked, shielding her eyes against the sun. "Looks like glass or plastic." Their curiosity, the innate engine of any good scientist, was ignited. The flash had come from deep within, a crevice in a massive talus slopea, chaotic jumble of boulders, some as large as small cars. Carefully, they picked their way across the unstable field of rock. Ben, an experienced climber, peered down into the dark fissure. The glint was still there, about 20 feet down, wedged tightly between two enormous slabs of granite. He could just make out a rectangular shape. It was a box of some kind. "I'm going down," he said, already uncoiling a rope from his pack. "Something's not right about this." He anchored the rope to a solid horn of rock and rappelled into the cool darkness of the crevice. As his feet touched down on a narrow ledge, he saw it clearly. It was a pelican case, a heavy-duty, waterproof container used to protect sensitive equipment. It was battered and scraped, but its distinctive polymer shell was intact. What was it doing here, buried deep within a rockslide in one of the most remote corners of the state? With considerable effort, he managed to pry it free. It was heavy. He clipped it to his harness and ascended back into the sunlight. Together, he and Maya placed the case on a flat rock. The latches were stiff with grit, but they managed to force them open. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was a professional-grade DSLR camera with a large lens attached. It was pristine. The case had done its job perfectly, protecting its contents from 6 years of brutal mountain weather. Beside the camera was a small, leather-bound field journal. They knew immediately that they had stumbled onto something significant. This was not lost hiker's gear. This was a professional's kit, and it was hidden. They carefully closed the case, packed up their own equipment, and hiked out. The next morning, they walked into the Gunnison County Sheriff's Office and placed the pelican case on the counter. The deputy who took their report was young and had to look up the old case file. But when he called Ranger David Kane, the retired ranger's voice crackled with an energy he hadn't felt in years. He drove to the station immediately. As soon as he saw the case and the camera inside, he knew. The question mark that had haunted him for 6 years began to straighten into an exclamation point. The case was dormant, but it was not dead. Kane, working with the Sheriff's Department, officially reopened the investigation into the disappearance of Dr. Alistair Finch. The camera, its memory card, and the field journal were sent to the state's digital forensics laboratory. The Pelican case itself, along with soil and rock samples from the crevice where it was found, were sent to a geological analysis unit. Maya and Ben's offhand comment to the deputies that the rocks in the crevice seemed a different color and texture from the surrounding talus slope had been dutifully noted in the report, a detail that Kane found particularly intriguing. The first report came back from the digital forensics lab. The team had managed to power the camera and access the memory card. It was full of stunningly beautiful, high-resolution photographs of geological formations, the last records of Alistair's final project. And then they found the last file. It was a video. The file was corrupted, the video feed just a black, unreadable screen. But the audio had been partially preserved. Kane listened to the recovered clip in a sterile lab, his heart pounding. The recording was short, only about a minute long. It began with the muffled sound of wind, then the distinct scrape of rock on rock. A man's voice, Alistair's, could be heard, but his words were indistinct, muffled as if the camera were inside a bag or a jacket. Then there was a sharp, percussive sound, followed by silence. The audio captured nothing more. The battery had died, freezing the file in that final, ambiguous moment. It was a frustrating, tantalizing clue that seemed to lead nowhere. It supported the theory of a fall, but it proved nothing. The real revelation, the one that blew the case wide open, came not from the camera, but from the box that had protected it. The geological analysis report was dense, technical, and utterly game-changing. The dust and mineral particulates found embedded in the scratches and seams of the Pelican case did not match the granite of the basin where the students had found it. The trace evidence was a unique and specific composite, bentonite clay, rich with microscopic flecks of barite and hematite. The geologists were certain. This mineral signature was a fingerprint, and it belonged to a single, specific location in the entire state of Colorado, the historic Red Mountain Mining District, over 100 miles north of where Alistair Finch had disappeared. And then came the second, equally stunning conclusion. The rocks that had buried the case, the ones the students had noted as being different, were not native to that basin. They were mine tailings. Their composition matched the waste rock from the Red Mountain District. Someone had not only placed the camera case in that crevice, but they had also brought in tons of rock from over 100 miles away and dumped it on top, creating an artificial rock slide to hide it. The paradigm of the investigation shattered. For 6 years, everyone had operated under one fundamental assumption. Alistair Finch had gone missing in the Fossil Ridge wilderness. The search, the theories. Elena's vigilance was all centered on that trailhead, on those mountains. That assumption was wrong. The science was irrefutable. Alistair, or at least his camera, had been in a mining district 100 miles away. The scene of his disappearance had been staged. The search had been a massive 6-year-long misdirection. This was no longer a case of a hiker lost to the elements. This was a homicide investigation. David Kane, officially brought back as a consultant on the cold case task force, felt a surge of cold, righteous anger. They had been manipulated. Someone had used the vastness of the wilderness as a weapon, counting on its power to conceal their crime. But they had made a mistake. They had left behind a fingerprint made of dust and stone. With this new, shocking direction, the entire investigation was reframed. Kane and the detectives pulled Alistair's old research files from the evidence locker. They were looking for a connection to the Red Mountain Mining District. They found it in a folder of his preliminary research proposals. Alistair's final expedition wasn't just a general survey. He had been quietly investigating rumors of fraudulent activity in the region. Specifically, he was looking into a practice known as salting, where conspirators would introduce valuable minerals into soil or core samples to artificially inflate the value of a mining claim. A salted claim could be sold to unsuspecting investors for millions. Alistair's notes mentioned his suspicion of several small-time wildcat operations in the Red Mountain area. His final text to Elena took on a chilling new significance. Found a promising formation. He hadn't been talking about a natural geological feature. He had found evidence. He had found the fraud. The detectives began a deep dive into the mining claims that were active in that district 6 years ago. They cross-referenced financial records, permits, and personnel lists. One name surfaced again and again: Marcus Thorne, the sole proprietor of a struggling prospecting company called Thorne Ventures. Thorne had been selling shares in a new gold claim that, on paper, looked incredibly rich. He had a minor criminal record for fraud from years earlier and a reputation among other prospectors for being aggressive and dishonest. When the detectives checked the initial witness interviews from 2017, they found him. Marcus Thorne had been questioned briefly. He was a known local contact of Alistair's, having exchanged a few emails with the geologist about access to the area. He had been dismissed as a person of interest almost immediately. His alibi was solid. On the day Alistair vanished, Thorne claimed he was working his claim all day. His remote, isolated claim. The very claim located in the heart of the bentonite-rich Red Mountain District. 2 detectives and Ranger Kane drove the 100 miles north. They found Marcus Thorne not at a mine, but at a suburban landscaping business he now owned. He was older, heavier, with the soft hands of a man who no longer worked the rock himself. When he saw the officers and the familiar weathered face of the old park ranger, a flicker of panic flashed in his eyes before being buried under a veneer of weary irritation. They sat with him in his small, cluttered office. They didn't accuse him. They didn't even mention Alistair Finch at first. They simply laid out the science. They showed him the geological analysis report. Kane, his voice low and steady, explained the unique mineral signature of bentonite, barite, and hematite. He spoke about how such a specific composite could only be found in one place. He pushed a satellite photograph of Thorne's old claim across the desk. Thorne stared at the photograph. His composure, so carefully constructed, began to crumble at the edges. The detectives could see the sweat beading on his forehead. The science was absolute, a language more damning than any witness testimony. "The rocks talk, Marcus," Kane said softly. "Alistair Finch taught me that, and they're telling us a story. We just want to hear your side of it." Marcus Thorne finally broke. The story that spilled out was not one of a monstrous, premeditated murder, but a pathetic, sordid tale of greed and panic. Alistair had contacted him. He had found evidence that Thorne was salting his samples with gold dust purchased from an out-of-state supplier. He arranged to meet Thorne at the claim, scientist to prospector, to confront him with the data. Alistair, ever the man of integrity, was going to expose him. At the remote mine site, the 2 men argued. Thorne, his life's work and fraudulent scheme about to collapse, was desperate. He begged Alistair to walk away. Alistair refused. In a moment of blind panic and fury, Thorne shoved him. It was a single, violent push. Alistair, caught off balance, stumbled backward. The back of his head struck the sharp iron corner of a piece of mining machinery. He fell to the ground and did not move. The death was instantaneous. Thorne stared at the body of the respected geologist, the reality of what he had done crashing down on him. His life was over. He would be ruined, imprisoned. His panic gave way to a cold, desperate cunning. He called his younger brother, the only person he trusted, who helped him form a plan. The cover-up was both meticulous and brutal. They put Alistair's body in Thorne's truck and drove it deep into the mountains to a long-abandoned mine shaft, a place no one had entered for 50 years. They dropped his body into the darkness. He was gone. But they knew a simple missing person case might lead back to them. They needed to create a convincing alternative narrative. They needed to make it look like a tragic hiking accident. They took Alistair's pack, with his camera and journal inside. They drove his Bronco south, all the way to the Sentinel Pass trailhead, and left it there. Then came the masterstroke of their deception. They knew the area would be swarmed by searchers. They had to plant a clue, but one that was well hidden, one that might not be found for years, if ever. They went back to their mine, loaded a truck with tailings the waste rock from their illegal operation, and drove it under the cover of darkness to that remote basin, a place they knew from illegal dumping runs in the past. They placed the pelican case deep in a crevice and buried it under tons of rock, using the very earth Alistair studied to hide their crime. They had weaponized geology against a geologist. They had sent hundreds of searchers on a 6-year chase for a ghost, all while the truth lay buried 100 miles away. Guided by Thorne's confession, investigators descended into the abandoned mine shaft. In the cold, silent darkness, they found what was left of Dr. Alistair Finch. The search was finally over. Marcus Thorne and his brother were arrested and charged with manslaughter and the desecration of human remains. The legal process ground forward, bringing a measure of justice to the case. The public narrative, once so cruel to Alistair's memory, was rewritten. He was no longer a deserter, but a hero who had died in the pursuit of scientific truth, silenced for his integrity. For Elena and Liam, the resolution was not a victory. It was not a moment of joy or triumph. It was simply an answer. It was the end of the long, agonizing torture of not knowing. It was a period at the end of a sentence that had run on for 6 agonizing years. They held a memorial service on a clear September day at a scenic overlook facing the Sawatch Range. The mountains that had held the secret for so long stood silent and immense, their granite faces indifferent to the human tragedy that had played out in their shadow. Elena stood with her son, now old enough to understand, and spoke not of the darkness of the last 6 years, but of the light his father had brought into the world. The wound of grief was still there, a permanent part of her landscape, but it was no longer a gaping, open question. It was a scar, a mark of a great love and a profound loss. The quiet, somber truth was a form of peace. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.